Chapter 1 Discovery. Dr. Richard Elman shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the Jeep bounced over the uneven dirt road. Dust plumed up in the rearview mirror, blending into the hazy orange of the setting sun. He had seen a lot in his career, but this was the first time he'd been summoned to a place like Greenfield, an out-of-the-way town where the most exciting thing to happen was the annual pie eating contest. Dr. Elman? The driver, a young man with a thick southern drawl, glanced over. You ever been out this way before? No, I can't say I have, Richard replied, his eyes scanning the landscape. The fields were endless, dotted with the occasional farmhouse, even more run down than the last. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut hay, mingled with something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Not much out here except for farmland and stories, the driver said, giving a half smile. Heard you hear about those weird creatures folks been seeing. Richard nodded, absently fingering the edge of his notebook. That's right. I've been called in to investigate some unusual sightings. People are describing creatures that look like spiders or woodlice, but larger, and there's something about hay? The driver chuckled, a sound rough and unamused. You'll see. Ain't like anything you've ever seen before. Whole town's been talking about it. My cousin, she swears she saw one turn into a bale of hay right in front of her. Freaked her out good. Turn into hay? Richard's brow furrowed. He'd read the reports, but hearing it aloud was something else. That doesn't make any sense. It's crazy. The driver finished for him. Yeah, that's what everyone thought at first, but more people saw him. Couldn't be just one person going nuts. The Jeep came to a halt in front of a large, weathered barn. Its red paint had long faded, and the roof sagged as if weighed down by years of neglect. Richard stepped out, the ground crunching under his boots. He looked around, his senses alert. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell of hay and something else. Something faintly metallic. This is the place, the driver said, climbing out and adjusting his cap. I'll wait here if it's all the same to you. Richard nodded, barely hearing him. His focus was on the barn, on the faint scratching noise coming from within. It was a sound that reminded him of insects, the kind that scuttled in the dark corners of old buildings. He pulled out his flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dim interior of the barn. Inside, the light flickered over the stacks of hay bales, neatly piled. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Just a dusty old barn with nothing out of the ordinary. But then, as his eyes adjusted, Richard noticed something. One of the bales, far at the back, seemed to be moving. He squinted, stepping closer. The scratching grew louder, more distinct. He hesitated, heart pounding. Hello? He called out, feeling foolish. What was he expecting? An answer? He took another step, the beam of his flashlight steady on the moving table. As he approached, the scratching stopped. The bale lay perfectly still. Richard's hand reached out, almost involuntarily, to touch the raw straw surface. The moment his fingers brushed the hay, it felt alive, warm. He jerked his hand back, a chill running down his spine. The hay smelled of earth and decay, like old secrets buried in the ground. What the hell? He muttered, taking a step back. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, what he was feeling. It wasn't possible. None of this was possible. And then it happened. The bale shifted, the straw rustling as if something beneath it was struggling to break free. Richard stumbled back, his flashlight beam wavering. The bale seemed to swell, its form twisting, the outline of legs, many legs, emerging from the straw. And just as quickly, it stopped. The bale settled back into its original shape, still and silent once more. Richard's breath came in short gasps. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There is more to this than just hay and spiders. He needed to know what these creatures were, where they came from, and why they were here. As he turned to leave, a faint sound caught his ear. A soft, rhythmic clicking, almost like a whisper, echoing through the barn. Richard froze, the flashlight slipping from his fingers and clattering to the ground. This was just the beginning. Chapter 2. First Encounter. Richard stepped into the early morning light. The fields around him bathed in a soft golden glow. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He adjusted his backpack, making sure his camera and specimen jars were secure. Today, he would find answers. The reports had led him here, to the old Thompson farm, where sightings had been most frequent. The barn loomed ahead, its faded red paints flaking off in the light. Richard's eyes swept the landscape, taking in every detail. The fields were quiet, the tall grass rustling softly in the breeze, but he felt a strange weight in the air, a tension that made his skin prickle. He moved towards the barn, his steps slow and deliberate, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. A chill ran down his spine, through the morning was warm. There was a presence here, something he couldn't see but could almost feel, like a static charge in the air. Richard stopped just outside the barn door, his hand resting on the rough wood. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was no ordinary research trip. He had to be ready for anything. With a firm push, he opened the door. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through the slats of the weathered barn walls. The familiar scent of hay filled his nostrils, mingled with the musty odor of old wood and something else. Something that he couldn't quite place. It was a scent that made his stomach turn, metallic and sharp. His eyes scanned the interior, noting the piles of hay bales stacked neatly against the far wall. They looked ordinary, but Richard's experience the previous day had taught him better. He approached cautiously, his flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the shadows. As he moved closer, the silence grew heavier, pressing in around him. The hay bales lay still, but there was a tension in the air, a sense of something lurking just out of sight. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He reached out, hand trembling, and touched the nearest bale. The moment his fingers brushed the straw, the bale shifted, a ripple through it. Richard stumbled back, his flashlight beam wavering. The hay seemed to move of its own accord, twisting and writhing, the faint outline of legs appearing briefly before it settled back into stillness. Richard's breath came in short gasps, his mind racing. He had seen it. He wasn't imagining things. There was something alive in there, something hiding beneath the guise of hay. He took a step closer, his fear tempered by a growing sense of curiosity. What were these creatures? How did they transform? He needed to understand. He crouched down, peering at the bale, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. The barn was silent, save for the faint rustling of straw. Richard leaned in, reaching out to pull at the hay to see what lay beneath. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. A sharp, clicking sound coming from the far corner of the barn. Richard froze, his head snapping up. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like the tapping of many small legs on wood. It was the same sound he had heard the day before, the sound that had haunted his dreams. He turned the flashlight toward the noise, the beam illuminating the far end of the barn. His heart skipped a beat. There in the shadows, something moved. A shape, low to the ground, scuttling away from the light. Richard took a step forward, the beam steady, trying to get a better look. As the light caught the creature, it froze, its body tensing. It was nothing Richard had ever seen. A grotesque fusion of spider and woodlouse, its body covered in a rough, molted carapace. Its eyes glinted in the light, dark and unblinking. For a moment they stared at each other, man and creature, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, the creature moved. It turned, its legs blurring into motion as it scurried away, disappearing into the shadows. Richard lunged forward, trying to catch it, but it was too fast. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the hay bale. The bale shifted under his weight, and Richard felt a moment of panic. He scrambled back, watching as the hay bale seemed to pulse, the shape beneath it moving, twisting, and then, as quickly as it began, it stopped. The bale lay still, the barn silent once more. Richard's hands shook, his mind a whirl of thoughts. He had seen them. They were real. He wasn't crazy, but what were they? Why were they here? As he stood in the dim light of the barn, surrounded by a silence, watching hay bales, a cold certainty settled over him. This was no ordinary phenomenon. There was something happening here, something far beyond his understanding. And whatever it was just beginning. Chapter 3. Research begins. The small lab at Greenfield's local university was a far cry from the state-of-the-art facilities Richard was used to, but it would have to do. It was barely more than a converted classroom, with outdated equipment and peeling paint, but Richard had quickly made it his own. The table was covered in samples, smart jars filled with pieces of hay, slides ready for the microscope, and pages of scribbled notes. Richard sat at the center of this chaos, peering through the eyepiece of the microscope. He adjusted the focus, his brow furrowing as he studied the sample. He'd taken it from one of the hay bales in the Thompson barn, hoping to find some clue of the creature's nature. But so far, it had been nothing but ordinary hay. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, filling the silence with their incessant hum. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the window, and Richard felt the weight of those shadows pressing in on him. He picked up his pen, jotting down his observations. Hay sample number 4, composition typical of Festica apprentices. No anomalies detected. Structure consistent with standard agricultural hay. He dropped the pen with a sigh, staring at the notes in front of him. It didn't make any sense. He had seen the creatures with his own eyes, seen them transform. And yet, every test he ran showed the same thing. Ordinary hay. It was as if the creatures left no trace, no evidence of their existence. Richard stood up, pacing the length of the room. His colleagues had been polite, but he could see the doubt in their eyes. Hallucinations, they suggested. Stress. Maybe even a trick of the light. Richard knew what he had seen. He wasn't crazy. He stopped at the window, looking out over the quiet campus. Students passed by in small groups, laughing and talking, oblivious to the strange events unfolding just beyond the town limits. Richard watched them for a moment, a pang of envy tightening in his chest. They didn't know the darkness lurking in the fields, the hidden danger waiting to strike. A knock at the door broke his reverie. Richard turned to see a young woman, one of the university's research assistants, standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Dr. Elman," she said, "Professor Kane asked me to check in on you, see if you needed anything." Richard managed to smile, but felt forced. "Thank you, Jenna. I'm fine, just a little stuck." He gestured to the table, to the rows of jars and notes. "These samples, they aren't showing me anything new. I'm beginning to wonder if I'm wasting my time." Jenna stepped inside, her eyes curious as she looked over the jars. "These are from the hay bales people have been talking about. The ones that change?" Richard nodded. "Yes, but so far there's nothing unusual. No chemical differences, no signs of foreign organisms. Just hay." Jenna picked up one of the jars, turning it in her hands. "What if the transformation isn't physical? What if it's, I don't know, something else?" Richard frowned, considering. "You mean like a projection? An illusion?" "Maybe." Jenna set the jar down carefully. "Or maybe it's something we don't have the tools to detect. Something beyond our current understanding." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. The idea had occurred to him, but he hadn't wanted to believe it. If these creatures were operating on a level he couldn't comprehend, how could he ever hope to understand them? "I've been looking through the university's archives," Jenna continued. "There are some old records from decades ago that mention strange sightings in the area. Creatures, transformations. I thought you might want to see them." Richard's interest piqued. You found records. From when?
About 50 years ago, Jenna said. There was a similar incident. People reported seeing strange creatures, but no one could ever prove anything. The records are vague, but it sounds a lot like what you've been describing.
Richard felt a surge of excitement mixed with a flicker of fear. If there had been previous sightings, then this wasn't a one-time phenomenon. These creatures had been here before, and if they were back now, it meant they had a reason. Thank you, Jenna, he said, his mind racing. I'd like to see those records. Anything that might help me understand what's happening here. Jenna nodded, and Richard watched her leave, his thoughts a whirl of possibilities. If these creatures had been here before, then someone might have studied them, might have found a way to fight them. He had to find out more. He turned back to his notes. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The creatures were here for a reason, and whatever this reason was, it couldn't be good. The sense of unease that had been growing in him since he arrived in Greenfield was now a cold certainty. This was no ordinary research project. He was on the brink of discovering something that could change everything. Something that could turn the world he knew to something dark and unrecognizable. Richard picked up his pen, the nib scratching against the paper as he wrote. The lines were jagged, the ink bleeding into the page. What if this was just the beginning? He wrote, the words stark against the white of the paper. He stared at them, the truth of it settling deep in his bones. He had come here looking for answers, but all he found were more questions, more mysteries. And somewhere, out in the fields, the creatures were waiting. Chapter 4, halfway through. Chapter 4, Increasing Encounters. Richard stood at the edge of the field, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows over the landscape. The once peaceful town of Greenfield had changed. There was an unease in the air, a palpable tension that seemed to hang over everything. The townspeople whispered to each other, their voices low, their eyes constantly shifting to the fields, as if expecting to see something move in the tall grass. He pulled out his notebook, flipping through the pages. His notes were scattered, filled with hastily scribbled observations and half-formed theories. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. These creatures were appearing more frequently. The reports had doubled in the past week alone, each sighting eerier than the last. It wasn't just in the barns anymore. The creatures were showing up in open fields, near the edge of town, even close to people's homes. They were becoming bolder, more aggressive, as if they were no longer content to hide in the shadows. Richard could feel it in his bones. Something was drawing them out. He glanced back at the farmhouse, its windows dark, the silhouettes of a person visible against the flickering candlelight. The Thompsons had left the town 2 days ago, driven out by fear. They weren't the only ones. Richard had seen the trucks, the hurried packing, the silent departures. Greenfield was emptying, people fleeing from the unknown threat. Richard's jaw tightened. He had to find out why. Why now? Why here? There had to be a reason, a pattern, something he could use to understand what was happening. He turned back to the field, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. The grass rustled softly in the wind, the only sound in the stillness. Richard stepped forward, his feet crunching on the dry earth. He scanned the ground, looking for any sign, any clue. And then he saw it. A bale of hay, half hidden in the grass. It was out of place, sitting alone in the middle of the field. Richard's heart beat faster. He approached cautiously, the beam of his flashlight steady. The bale lay still, but Richard knew better than to trust appearances. He crouched down, his hand hovering over the rough straw. His fingers brushed against it, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the hay shifted, a faint rustling sound filling the air. Richard pulled his hand back, his eyes wide. The bale pulsed, the outline of something moving beneath the straw. Richard took a step back, his mind racing. The creatures were here. He could feel it. They were watching him, waiting. But why? What were they after? The wind picked up, rustling the grass around him, and Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He turned, scanning the field. The shadows seemed to stretch, to twist into shapes that weren't there before. The air was thick with a sense of something lurking, just out of sight. Richard's flashlight flickered, and for a moment, he thought he saw something. Of movement, a glint of eyes in the dark. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The shadows seemed to shift, to move closer, and then it was gone. The light steadied, and the field was empty once more. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, the silence pressing in on him. He knew he wasn't alone. The creatures were out there, hiding, watching. They were closer than ever. He turned back to the hay bale, his mind racing. There had to be a way to understand them, to find out what they wanted. He couldn't let fear cloud his judgment. He had to stay focused, to think. Richard pulled out his notebook, flipping to a blank page. He jotted down the time, the location, the appearance of the bale. He needed to record everything to find the pattern, the key to understanding. As he wrote, a thought occurred to him. The sightings were increasing, yes, but they were also following a path, a line that traced the edges of the town, the outskirts. It was almost as if the creatures were circling, closing in. Richard's pen paused, hovering over the page. What if they were? What if the creatures were being drawn to something at the center of this circle? He flipped back through his notes, tracing the pattern, the locations of the sightings. It formed a rough perimeter, a boundary around the town. His pulse quickened. If he could find what was at the center, maybe he could find the answer. Maybe he could stop them. Richard snapped his notebook shut, his mind made up. He had to find the center. He had to know what was drawing these creatures, what was pulling them from the shadows. He turned back to the field, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hay bale lay still, silent, as if waiting. Richard stepped forward, his jaw set, determination burning in his eyes. This wasn't just about the creatures anymore. It was about the town and the people who lived here. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they were all in danger, that something terrible was coming. As he walked back to the farmhouse, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint, rhythmic clicking he had come to dread. Richard quickened his pace, the sound following him, haunting him. He had to find the answer before it was too late.